That means it's go live. Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our monthly hot topic from Continuing Professional Education Services. I'm excited about this morning. We have a good speaker, a good topic. I would ask everybody if you can mute yourself and keep yourselves muted, though I can control you if I need to. You can have a choice of keeping your camera on and off or whatever you want to do. But of course, in this new world that we're in of virtual, just make sure that if you do have your camera on, that what we're seeing is appropriate at the time. There's been some interesting events already on some of these videos. So with that said, I do have also with me this morning my partner at Continuing Professional Education Services, Dr. George Berkowitz, and our Director of Operations, Julianne Masago. But I am going to jump right in. Our speaker this morning, speaking about the 2022 Environmental Legislative Agenda, is Tony Russo. I wrote up a little bio, Tony. So you ready? Okay.
Yes.
And I said to you the other day, I want to make sure I tell all the secrets that people don't know.
Okay.
So, Tony is a graduate of NJIT with a degree in mechanical engineering. Many people do not realize that, he actually not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. So, what's that?
I said, I guess that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. And it's funny, on your LinkedIn resume, you don't mention that you actually spent some time at DEP. We'll have to talk about that later.
It's really, I should. I appreciate, I'll have to update it.
It's not on there, and then you were also a consultant. You worked at GES. We didn't cross paths though. I had left before. We just spent about a half hour on the Chemistry Council of New Jersey, your time there. And then you decided for some reason that you needed to hop off to DC and become the deputy executive director of the National Lime Association, which actually I need some assistance. The pH of my lawn is terrible. So one of these days we got to talk about that, whatever you learned down there in those 2 years.
Yeah.
And you've been with CIANJ now for 9 years, and are currently the president as well as the publisher of Commerce Magazine, an all-around great guy who really has his pulse on a lot going on in Trenton, as well as everything throughout New Jersey, not just in the world of environment. So you have your hand in everything. So thanks for joining us this morning. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to give a little start. We had talked about giving some background as well as rolling out how bills become law.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. First, let me again say thank you to you, Phil, George, Jules. It's great to be part of this session today. You guys have been great to work with. So we appreciate everything you guys have done. I think these kind of sessions are important. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank Tracy Straka, who's on here from Creamer, who actually hired me. She was the chairperson at the time back in 2013 when I joined. And in my opinion, I'm sure a lot of you folks agree that Tracy is a visionary, and I'm happy that she's here today. So thank you, Tracy, for everything you've done. And I also want to give credit to one of my peers, Mike Eggington from the State Chamber. Mike and I remember when I started in the year 2000, I was doing more regulatory affairs, and Mike and I have kind of come up through the ranks in the last 22 years. So Mike, it's good to see you. But what I wanted to do today is, again, I want to kind of keep this conversational and informal. But for the folks on the call, I assume that many of you are practitioners, whether you're attorneys, LSRPs, environmental consultants. And I was always fascinated, again, like Phil said, as an engineer. I worked at the DEP for 4 years. I used to write the GIPDs permits, then as a consultant, and then more or less since 2000, did a lot of government affairs. And what I like to tell people is I know that there's always a focus on regulations and there's always a focus on policies and guidance, but we also have to remember that it all starts with legislation, right? And so when you think about the legislative sessions and the legislature, you got to think about, how it's made up, and not to get too into the weeds. And again, I want to get some feedback from everybody, but we just kicked off the 220th legislative session. And what that means basically is that, for the next 2 years, you're going to see upwards of about 10,000 bills being introduced that covers a variety of things. In checking the Senate Environment Committee and the Assembly Environment Committee, I'm looking at about 200 bills that have been reintroduced. So what happens is at the end of a 2-year cycle, whatever doesn't get signed into law has to be reintroduced and started all over again. So this is a 2-year cycle, right? And so when you think about the legislature, you got to think about the 2 houses. And I'll start with the assembly. We have 40 districts in New Jersey. Each district, and it's really complicated, and they're actually going through the redistricting session right now. But each district elects 2 assembly people. So you have about 80. You have 80 folks in Trenton, and then each district also picks a senator. So you have 120 people that really, out of 9.5 million people that are in the state, you have 120 plus the governor, so that's 121, that really is going to decide for the next 4 years, right? 2 years for the legislature, 4 years for Governor Murphy's term, really what's going to set the environmental agenda. And we'll get into a lot of the details here. But again, I think understanding the legislative process. So out of that 120 or 121 people that I mentioned, really the magic numbers are 21, 41, and 1. And what I mean by that is you don't need every legislator to vote on a bill, really. So think about this. 63 people, right, including the governor, really gets to decide out of 9.5 million people what becomes law in New Jersey. And then when something is signed into law, and we've all seen this, right? I know we have some attorneys on the call, is what happens then is you have to, whatever agency is involved, and we'll be specific to DEP today, they have to develop regulations, and then regulations come out. That could take 2 years, right? And then there's a lot of times, and I'll talk about, this happens all the time, and it's really not going to be something that can be fixed easily. But when the intent of a law goes to the agency then develops regulations, and usually they put together a rule team, and then they start interpreting what the intent of the legislation was. And then regulations are proposed, and then the regs are finalized, and then what happens, right? We all have experienced this where maybe your situation, your project just didn't fit the reg, just didn't fit the intent of the statute, right? So then you have to have policy or guidance. So if you think about those 3 buckets, it really defines what we all do. And it really is in our best interest to really understand each one of those buckets, how we can influence them now. But that's the, Phil, I know I probably went on a little too long, but I wanted to give everybody a sense of the legislative process and why it's important. And one thing I'll say is, and again, I want to respect the fact that we also have a lot of attorneys as members. A lot of times, and I was part of this years ago, when a regulation goes final, you could adjudicate, you could sue. It's really difficult. It really takes some time, right? Policy guidance, what do? You advocate, you go in, you meet with the commissioner, you meet with the assistant commissioners, you try to get something interpreted differently, clarified. But in my mind, and I'm sure Mike would agree, and this is something that, again, I learned from Hal Bozeth, my former boss, but a lot of times it's just easier to amend the legislation. So if you're not happy with something, that's why, as he would say, God made amendments, Tony, right? Go in and work out amendments and try to get something fixed. And you see it all the time. Mike and I see it every day. I mean, so just, I want people to appreciate that sometimes it's a lot easier to go back to your representatives and advocate for an amendment.
Tony, that's actually a good lead. And I was actually just thinking, now, can any of us just go in? I mean, I know New Jersey years back had passed a law relative to lobbying. And so I guess, in that scenario, if there's something that we see, what's the best avenue for us to take as non-lobbyists?
Yeah, it's a good point. And yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, the answer is, and I know, Mike, I don't know if you guys are going to publish it, but we're going to come up with a new booklet, which is like a pocket handbook of all your legislators. But, what interests me, Phil, is when I talk to a lot of our companies, I say, do you know who your mayor is? Do you know who your state representative? A lot of them don't, which is surprising, right? So, one of the things that we're trying to do is educate them to say, you should know, you have to have a relationship with your legislator. So if you have a relationship, you could pick up the phone, call them and say, I need something fixed. I have something that needs to be addressed. And one of the things that I get asked a lot is, how does something get introduced? It could be an idea. It could be a thought. It could be something, a problem. And again, we can kind of get into some of these things, but you go to your legislator, Phil, right? So if you picked up the phone down in Ocean County, you call your legislator and you say, I think this is something that should really be in law. Then what they do is they transfer it over to the Office of Legislative Services within the State House. It's a group of attorneys, they're nonpartisan. what their job is to take that idea, that concept, that issue, and develop legislation. And what they run is a conflicts check, right? They say, well, geez, this is the issue. Is it going to, modify a statute that was maybe, passed in 1985, something that was passed in 1995? And then they come up with a bill number, and then it gets introduced, and then it goes public, and then people like me and Mike will be on it, and we send it out to our associations, and then that's how, you kind of weigh in on it. So it's easier, Phil, if you're part of a coalition, if you're part of an association, and that's why the LSRPA is important. The state chamber, CINJ, a lot of the groups, is because usually, we have those relationships where you may not have those relationships.
There's only unique situations that you can get something done by yourself. And you were going to touch a little upon that as we start going into specific items, but you wanted to talk a little about this steel slag.
Yeah. So, but before I do that, in terms of the process and the ideas, I mean, that's how it works. But I wanted to kind of start at the rooftop, in terms of what I see in 2022.
Sorry about that. Good point. Yep.
And then we can kind of get into some of the issues. So obviously the big news last November was Governor Murphy won a second term. There's no surprise out there that, he's got a climate change agenda. He's got a new energy master plan that I could talk about. So with the governor winning a second term, there were a lot of things that he didn't accomplish. I mean, he accomplished a lot in his first term that he promised during the campaign. There's a lot of things that he's going to want to do in terms of environmental, right? It's definitely going to be, climate change, energy master plan, but also the legislature. We have 18 new assembly people, 18, right? And we have 5 new senators. So now this is going to be a learning curve. And on Monday, I had to testify on one of our bills before the Assembly Environment Committee, and 3 of them were brand new. And so a lot of them may not have environmental background. So it's really incumbent upon all of us to really educate those folks in terms of our position on the issues. And again, Mike could probably weigh in here, but one of the things I keep telling people is you're all practitioners. The last thing you want to do is get into too many technical details. You want to kind of keep this very simple. You really truly have an elevator pitch, 3 minutes to tell a legislator why this is good or bad. And that's all they want to know. Why is it good or bad? And then you modify something. So I definitely see, climate change, storm resiliency, right? What happened with Ida last September, the flood areas, I mean, it spooked a lot of people. I could tell you coming up to work here in North Jersey, I had to go to Hackensack. Hackensack was underwater. Little Ferry was underwater. I mean, these are things that just can't happen. I mean, Route 46 right by Teterboro Airport was underwater. So that you're going to see a lot of legislation dealing with storm resiliency. You're going to start seeing a lot of recycling issues, right? That's something that we can kind of talk about. But these are the issues, again, going up to the rooftop that I'm seeing that's going to come down. You have, and we'll talk about this, emerging contaminants, right? Yeah, everybody's heard of the PFAS. Everybody's been reading the news. There's going to be a big push to, take lead out of water pipes. What are they going to do there? Environmental justice, the governor signed that law in September 2020. And then this whole recycling push, right? The governor just signed legislation requiring a certain amount of content, recycled content in products for rigid plastics. And then you have money. And this is where I want to kind of spend a couple of minutes. And again, I've been doing this 22 years now in Trenton. I've never seen a time where Trenton had so much money. And yesterday we had an economic outlook event, and we had Charlie Steindl, who was the former economist for the state of New Jersey, and even he said the same thing. I can't remember the last time New Jersey had this kind of money. Just to give folks an idea, just from the American Rescue Plan, New Jersey itself, the state got $6 billion. Municipalities and counties got $4 billion. Park that. Then you have the infrastructure plan that the president signed. New Jersey is slated to get $13 billion, right, to be used for roads, bridges, tunnels, infrastructure. Could also be used for sewer upgrades, could be used for a lot of things. Park that. Last year, the state finished with a $6 billion surplus, right? So do the math. There's a lot of money there. And I think one of the things that's going to be front and center, I know, for associations is, making sure that the state government, the feds, and everybody, county, locals, that they're transparent in how this money is going to be spent, that there's a stakeholder process that would allow us to kind of weigh in and say, hey, by the way, here's an issue that needs to be addressed. And so, if there's ever a time, Phil, where we really have to focus in on our advocacy efforts, it's now, because we're not going to have this time again where you have so much money that the state's able to spend and they have to spend it wisely. Now, one of the things they said is it's going to come out in drips. So don't expect it to all be spent this year. This is where I think when we hear the governor's budget address, which is now scheduled for March 8th, that starts the season, right? So when the governor gives his budget address, then the Assembly and the Senate start holding public hearings, and then they have until June 30th to figure out how they're going to spend the money or the budget for FY23. But I got to tell you, we'll be focused in on the money. It's important. A lot of this money can go for brownfields, sewer upgrades, a lot of environmental related programs, and we're going to look forward to working with them on it.
Yeah, put on your list. I mean, as an LSRPA, and I'm sure many of us on this call, we take calls every day from PRCRs who do not have the money to remediate their sites, and there's really nowhere to go, where they're 25 years removed from the site and they get a rogue letter from the DEP because of an open case number. So keep that in mind when you're talking about where money could go, because that is definitely a place that somebody needs some help, and there are definitely people who need help. And now you just answered my question, by the way, as to why March 7th was chosen as the day for the mask mandate to end in schools.
Oh, well, March 8th is the budget address.
Right. So March 7th is the day that the mask mandate ends.
Yeah.
Just interesting. I was wondering where that date came from.
Yeah, and actually, it just came out, I guess it was a couple of days ago. He was supposed to give it the budget address on February 22nd, and it got bounced back a couple of weeks. Look, we don't expect a lot of major taxes or fees. I think it's more or less the plan on how this money is going to be spent. But my point is, the money's there. It's a question now of building those advocacy initiatives and coalitions and really, prioritizing your issues.
I mean, and before we jump into some of the specifics that you kind of laid out, a few of them, I mean, how do you think it's going to work? I mean, the Senate has changed with Sweeney now gone and a new, Senate president. Some seats in the Assembly changed over from the aisle. I mean, I want to say New Jersey is a little more neutral than it was, 6 months ago. How do you think that's going to affect the governor's agenda?
Good question, Phil. And Speaker Coughlin is the only one that remains, right? And obviously the governor. So the new Senate president is Nick Scutari. He's an attorney. He's from Union County. He chaired the Judiciary Committee for the last, 13, 14 years. A lot of people don't know him, right? So I think he's going to be out and about trying to get to know us, business groups. Having Senate President Sweeney since 2008 or 9. I mean, this is a change, right? And the other thing that I find fascinating is I'm a Central Jersey guy. Is historically, when you would have a speaker from North Jersey, and when I say North Jersey, it's north of 195. You would always have a Senate president from South Jersey. It was that balance, right? This is the first time in my memory, Mike, I don't know about you, but that now you have Union County is the Senate president's domicile, and then you have the speaker in Middlesex County, right? So, if I'm the South Jersey folks, cause for concern. Not to say that there's going to be any bias or anything like that, but I just think that's worth noting, because now we're going to be on a mission to get to know the Senate president, get to know how he operates, what his priorities are, and that's going to start to come out, as he's going out and about and meeting people. So, but that's what we have to do, is really get to know who the legislators are.
And so when you said he was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee for 13 years, is that the same Judiciary Committee that does appointments?
Correct. Yeah.
And
I think now the new chair is Senator Stack from Hudson County. So, but again, remember, Scutari was an attorney, so it's kind of interesting. And I don't believe Senator Stack is an attorney. So, and they handle all the appointments, correct?
Yeah.
So just getting back to your question about the governor's agenda, I think the Senate president and I think the speaker will probably work with the governor on a lot of these initiatives. I mean, we're starting to see it already, and I could kind of talk about it again when I go up back to that rooftop. It's the climate change, it's the energy master plan, it's storm resiliency, it's recycling, more, taking things out of the landfills. It's a lot of these programs that we're going to start see, a lot of the things that the governor can't do on his own through an executive order, he's going to have to work with the legislature to get legislation passed, and that's going to be where these decisions and issues come up.
Why don't we talk about an easy lift as we start? Because you mentioned landfills. So
Yeah.
plastic recycling, and again, as somebody who goes food shopping and leaves with 30 bad plastic bags, I know my life is going to dramatically change in the next couple of months, weeks. How is that affecting every business in New Jersey?
Yeah, so this was a couple of years ago. So May 1st, the single-use plastic ban goes into effect. And there's been a campaign within the Department of Community Affairs, and I know some other groups like Melanie Willoughby's group, they've been trying to educate folks to say, if you're a ShopRite or a big food store, and again, there are exemptions and exceptions, come May 1st, you can't use or sell single-use plastic bags. That's going to impact a lot of cafeterias, a lot of food people. They're going to have to go. And by the way, you just can't, default back down to paper. Again, this is all, I don't want to get too into the weeds of it, but, a lot of people probably aren't really ready about this because people have been focused so much about the pandemic for the last 2 years. But, again, that's May 1st. The governor last month signed what really is going to be a game changer, at least in my opinion. I mean, any manufacturer that produces a rigid plastic container starting in 2024 is going to have to contain a certain amount of that plastic from recycled content. Think about that. So that's going to mean that they're going to have to update their manufacturing equipment. The next thing is there going to be enough supply for that plastic to go into these containers? And again, the bill now law gets into glass containers. I think they also ban certain styrofoam cups and some other things, but that was just signed into law last month. So there's a lot going on. You're going to see plastic, a lot of things on the plastic front. There's been legislation on reducing food waste. There's been a lot of legislation on getting folks to really update their district management plans. I mean, so there's a lot there, Phil, that on the plastic recycling that people just should start preparing again. And again, if you think about office buildings and everything, yeah, they may be impacted too with the single-use plastic bag.
And also, I mean, you go to a restaurant now, if you need a straw, you have to ask for one. And it's this paper straw that falls apart in your mouth as you're using it. But that's the new reality, unless somebody starts giving straw, metal straws out at trade shows, and you stick that in your pocket. Probably not a bad giveaway. And I know my daughter has one that kind of opens and closes, so a good thing to have. So let's jump into something else. And I'll give you your choice. We had on our list here, we had A901 and steel slag. So whichever one you want to start with.
So I'll start with the A901. This is the dirty dirt. And I want to give people kind of like a background, right? Because this is what I've been spending a lot of my time on. And this just goes to what I was saying earlier about the legislative process, about how this all things work. But just to kind of set the stage. So back in 2012, we had Superstorm Sandy. You had a couple of cases that made the news. I think it was like Jersey Recycling and Cliffwood Beach, where you had bad dirt that showed up into areas that it shouldn't have shown up, and then investigations started, right? So the State Commission of Investigation starts to do their investigating, and in 2016 they have a public hearing. In 2017, and I remember this well, and I'm sure Mike was there too in the State House, where Senator Smith brought him before his committee, and SCI, by the way, is the State Commission of Investigations. They finalized their report to say, wait a minute, we think there's a lot of nefarious people out there that are dealing with dirty dirt, and that we ought to apply the A901 licensing to soil, right? Because at that point it was really just solid waste. That was 2017. Goes through this. It takes 2 years, right? It takes 2 years. The bill gets introduced. It goes through, signed into law in 2019. And I remember, because we testified on this, we said, wait a minute. You got to clarify those business concern definitions. You got to clarify what broker means, and consultant and salesperson. Unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons, the law was signed. Then what happened? The pandemic. So then the governor, through his executive order, says, we're going to stay all these deadlines until the pandemic is over. So now fast forward, here we are in February 2022. By the way, the DEP said last October you had to register. If you think you're going to be impacted by this dirty dirt law, you need to register. That's the first thing you need to do. I talked to Mark Peterson. I think there were 650 registrations that were submitted. Then they come out with this FAQ. Then they come out with the stakeholder process. I think there was one meeting in December. The next meeting, I think, is scheduled for March 1st. And now, about 2 months ago, we approached Senator Smith and we said, Senator, we think there's got to be a lot of things that need to be cleaned up, clarified. And he agreed. I mean, we had a good meeting with him last month where we said, you know, you really want to go after, you really should exempt landscapers. There should be a de minimis level. And I think he agreed. And there should be a exemption for utilities. There should be, you know, a self-generator exemption maybe. And then the harder thing is, you know, how do you clarify who's subject to the A901 license? Because from what people told me, if you go through this A901 process, it's lengthy. It involves the division, it involves the Department of Law, Public Safety, the Attorney General's office, the state police. You know, they'll go 5, 6, 7 people deep in your family, and they'll do background checks and fingerprinting. I mean, so it regulates the individual and not the material, and that's the distinction here. It's about which individuals do we want to go after, do we want to regulate? And so there's been a lot of confusion as to, wait a minute, and I'll give you some examples. If I'm an LSRP of record at a site, you're exempt. But if you're not an LSRP of record and you're just hired as a consultant, and maybe one of your team members works on that project, you might get an attorney that says, I think you might be subject, you might be considered a broker if you take that soil pile and send it somewhere, so you have to apply for the A901. The concern now is that the deadline to submit a full application is April 15th. So we worked with the senator and the Office of Legislative Services, again, going back to, you know, what their role is. And I talked to them last week, and the OLS folks are saying, you know what, Tony, we still got to work with the DEP. We're trying to get answers. I've talked to Mark Peterson. He's been very good, and he's trying to work through these issues. First problem, Phil, is the deadline, right? So if you missed the October 14th deadline, and you're really supposed to not be operating if you think you're subject to it because you didn't get a registration approval. And then you have to get your application in. The application's not easy. One member actually called me. They already got a bill. They applied for the A901 and they got a bill. And so, you know, even though the permit hasn't been issued, and again, I want to give credit to the department because we're all trying to work through these issues. The problem is going back to that legislative calendar, in that I think Senator Smith's committee meets today. Next time they meet may be at the middle of March. So we're going to be bumping up against this April 15th deadline. But the good news here, and this is where I'm still optimistic that we can get a lot of these issues resolved, either through the DEP or through a legislative fix. But, you know, stay tuned on that because, you know, again, the timing here is going to be kind of difficult.
And there was so much confusion. People didn't know if they needed to apply back in October. And even just listening to you say it again, you know, an LSRP has an exemption, but, you know, the company has to apply for an A901. And I think it's whoever the senior staff member, president, whatever, goes through this extensive background check and everything like that. How is that equivalent? You know, I mean, should every company now just go out and hire an LSRP because then they're going to be exempt on all the sites?
Well, that's a good question, right? Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Right. And so, you know, in my conversations with the department, I you know, again, and we submitted our concerns, and I'll be more than happy to share with anybody that, you know, wants a copy of it. You know, this again goes back to the amendment process, a stakeholder process. The department's going to have to clarify. They think they could clarify a lot of these issues in regulation, right, in policy. But the thing is, to what we were just talking about, if you know, are you going to apply? I look at it as like, it's like Hotel California. Once you send in your application, you're in. It's going to be tough to get out, right? Because now all eyes are on you, the confusion that could ensue. So one of the things that we want to try to, you know, we said to the department, to the senator, let's go after the folks that truly were the intent, right? So if you're going to handle that material, you know, whether you're the transporter or the final destination, clearly nobody's arguing that you should get the A901 for soil. Right, and a lot of them have A901s for solid waste, you know, and some of the other stuff. But Um, I guess, Phil, to answer your question, and again, talking to so many different members, a lot of folks are getting legal opinions, hold off, let's see what happens. Department is meeting with certain groups. They're trying to figure this out. I'm optimistic that, hopefully this month we'll have some clarity. But, again, we're trying to even fix the problem with, if you missed the registration deadline, what are you doing now? Because they're going to try to open it up. I'm not sure. And a lot of things are in the air right now, and it's really unresolved at this point.
And the key is, deadlines are passing and there's not even regulations in place. There's not even regulations proposed.
Right. Yeah, and there's no way that they can get the regs done before April 15th.
Yeah.
So,
No. Yeah,
but it's a good example. It's a good example of, I understood the intent. When you think about the timeline, you think about what they wanted to do. I think what really didn't help us here is obviously the pandemic happened and everything. People forget too, right? 2 years is a long time, right? And maybe this was on folks' radar, but I think in talking to a lot of our members, I think people just, have so much going on with the Delta variant, the Omicron. People just, oh, wait, I should have sent in a resume. I'm sorry, a registration in October. I missed it. What happens? What do I do? Send it in, but it gets denied. That goes back to, we got to come up with a better system that, these deadlines really don't mean anything. I think they were in the statute just to kind of give some definition to it. But in terms of expanding it and extending it, I think hopefully we'll have an answer this month.
Well, that's an interesting comment. Deadlines don't mean anything. As an LSRP who gets harped on every day from the DEP about deadlines, but the difference though is that we live, and as an LSRP, we're following rules and regulations that came down from laws. Here, you don't even have the rules and regulations to follow. So I guess in that absence, all you have is the law.
But think about it, Phil. So a deadline to me is really there because it wants to give you some clarity as to it's got to get done by this date, right? But can that date be moved, right? I think we have a situation here where, yeah, just because given everything else with the pandemic, there's probably makes sense to extend it. And that's what our hope is, that we'll at least have some additional time to clarify some of these issues, so you don't get people spending money and time submitting an application when they're never going to be part of this. And there's a lot of confusion. And again, the senator agreed, and he says, let's take a look at it, Tony. And that's what we're doing right now. I just wish I had more clarity for this call today, but this stuff takes time.
I was on the call with Senator Smith a couple weeks ago. I definitely think he has heard the concerns and is willing to address it, but there's still a lot of clarity because you don't know how he's going to address it and where it's going to go. And then, the wild card is what gets written from the,
Right.
his assistant or whatever that makes its way up. So, it's an interesting process. And again, I think anybody on this call here who just, maybe just woke up and heard about the A901 and moved soil, this is a big concern for anybody who's moving soil in New Jersey.
Sure.
What do you want to jump onto? You want to talk a little about the steel slag bill that got vetoed by the governor?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one where for a lot of the practitioners on this call, one of our companies actually there's one steel mill in New Jersey. They collect a lot of scrap steel and they make rebar, and part of the production process is steel slag comes out at the other side of it. And it's actually a good engineering aggregate that people could use in road bases. And so, for about 10 years, the facility worked it out with the DEP to get a beneficial use determination, and they came up with like 12 different, criteria to really for the use of the steel slag. Fast forward, the letter was issued. We said to ourselves, wait a minute, as an LSRP, and as many on this call today, would he or she feel more comfortable if that letter was turned into law, if it was codified? And it made a lot of sense. And the good news is the facility is in a speaker's district. The speaker agreed, and there was a bill that was introduced last session that would allow for the uses of the steel slag. And again, they have all the caveats. The regulations need to be issued, can't exceed any standards. So what we wanted to do is just codify it so that it's memorialized, and that LSRPs could then look at it in their sites and say, yeah, it makes sense to use the steel slag. Well, what happened was right before the holidays, went through, not one negative vote in the Assembly or Senate, And then the governor on January 11th vetoed it, basically saying, well, wait a minute, this is very specific. We're going to come out with regs. So what happened is it was vetoed, but the speaker reintroduced it. On Monday of this week, we testified along with some other folks. It cleared committee. I'm hoping that, Phil, something like that will work with the department and the governor's office to make sure that we can work it out and that they see why we want it codified. And this way, when it's codified, we hope that the LSRPs start to consider this steel slag. Reason why I think that's important is because going back to how the legislative process works, this is where you could take a specific situation and why not run it up the flagpole to see if there, makes sense to. I like to put them in that category. They ought to be a law, right? Maybe there ought to be a law on this, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But this is an example where I don't think anybody would argue that a letter is a letter, but if you could pass a law that says you could do this, carries a lot more weight.
Yeah, definitely. And Raina made a comment that October 2021, the food waste law went into effect, requiring large generators of food waste greater than 52 tons to stop using landfill. There's no regulations there either, similar to the dirty dirt situation.
Right. Yep. And look, the department has limited resources, and the regulatory process, for those of us that know this Administrative Procedures Act, right? You got to develop the rule. You got to put out the public comment. You got to, take a look at all the comments and then finalize. Rule of thumb, you're looking at a year, right? You're looking at least a year. That could change, but, sometimes that's where I think the legislation needs to sync up with the process and either improve the process or put more flexible dates in the legislation so you're not placed in a situation that's untenable where you're going to be out of compliance. Because again, most of the companies that we deal with, they all want to be in compliance, right? Nobody wants to have that threat of enforcement. So, this goes back to trying to align everything so this way you avoid these kind of situations.
Tony, and we didn't necessarily talk about this, so I'm going to throw you a curveball, and I apologize. But I don't know if you were on the Slag call the other day, but some of the stuff we heard out of the site remediation program was resources. They're now paying permit writers overtime because they can't get remedial permits out quick enough. And George could probably spend 2 hours talking about how the remedial action permit process is back to case management. You just laid out, if I did my math, 16 to 18 billion dollars that is coming into the state. And not that we all necessarily want larger government. I mean, is that something that an organization could take, to the Office of Budget and say, hey, here is a perfect example of where resources are needed? I mean, is that something that can be filtered back?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. It's I know that site remediation always talks about that they're self-funded, that they collect money in fees and that's how they do their budgeting. But there's got to be something that can help get people to review permits, because it seems like a year and a half waiting on permits is just too long.
So I always think that money's fungible, right? So what's going to happen is once the governor delivers his budget address on March 8th, then basically between March 8th and June 30th, each commissioner has to go up before both the Senate, budget committees and justify budgets. I think, what you're going to see, Phil, is you're going to see a lot of these issues being addressed because they realize that the money's there. So if you need resources, make your case, approach the two committees and hopefully it gets finalized. And by the way it works, and a lot of people don't appreciate how it works, but the Assembly, at the end of the day, the governor proposes a budget, the legislature more or less finalizes the budget, and then he can't add money back in, but he could take money out, and that's important, right? So he could veto it, but he can't add money back in. So ultimately, it is the legislature's call to agree with a commissioner to say we need more resources to address this issue. But those discussions should be happening now, Phil. I mean, because I agree with you. I mean, again, maybe there's just too much on their plate. And look, I could go through some bills here, again, that were reintroduced. And, each bill says the department shall come up with regulations within 90 days, right? Think about that.
Yeah, not going to happen.
Happens all the time because the nexus is with that agency. And the nexus is always that bill has to have a reg, has to have a policy, and again, if you're the department, do you have the people to do this, right? Do you have the people to do this? And that's where we have to just be careful.
Let's jump into a fun subject, brownfields. Yes, on that Slag call, towards the end of it, Bill Lidner, who is the head of the Office of Brownfields and a college colleague of mine, we spent many nights at Old Queens together back in the day, basically said that they're coming out with a press release in the next couple of days, which is going to inventory municipalities that they want to dedicate brownfields money to, and they want to see redevelopment. And then there's a secondary list that they've put together. We're talking about money. How much money is there, and how do we get it?
For brownfields?
Brownfields.
So last January, not this past one, but 2021, the governor signed a New Jersey Economic Recovery Act. That's a tax incentive. But there was a brownfields program, and I want to say the number was really low. It was like maybe $40 million. And again, that's a tax credit, not a grant. But an interesting one, Phil, because it's interesting because the NJEDA, the Economic Development Authority, really oversees a lot of the grants and the loans, for brownfields. They work in conjunction with the department. If you look at the HDRS fund, that's the Hazardous Discharge Site Remediation Fund, right? A lot of these funds will either, and again, Mike is still here. What you're going to see on these agendas that come out whenever they meet is you're going to see a lot of money shifting between funds, right? You could see, let's dedicate some of our corporate business tax money to open space. Let's take some of that money and put it into the Environmental Infrastructure Act. So I guess to answer your question, if that's what they want to do, we'll probably see that in the coming weeks and months, where again, right now, at least as far as I know, the brownfields is really through the EDA, through these grants and loan programs, and then whatever other monies, these funds that are out there, they could always amend the law to make sure that we could transfer those monies. And I'm sure that's a good way to get the money that they want. So
it's interesting. Another perfect example of resources. Bill made it clear that he is one man standing right now with an assistant because everybody else in his group are gone, either retired or transferred out. So as much as brownfields is important in New Jersey, there's no resources being put to staffing in that area, which was interesting.
Right. So real quick, the brownfields, it's called the Brownfields Impact Fund, and this is on the EDA's website. You could apply for either a grant or a loan of up to $350,000 per project. And again, this is just some feedback I've received going back to the Economic Recovery Act. 17 programs. There was things called Ignite, Emerge, so many programs that came out. And one member said to me, you know what, Tony, the view is just not worth the climb. A lot, and this is where you got to assess it in terms of there's application requirements, prerequisites, you got to qualify. You may have to pay prevailing wage. You may have to raise your minimum wage. I mean, there are a lot of things. The programs, are definitely fruitful, but you just got to stay the course. And whether it makes sense for you on a project basis, that's an individual decision.
You just touched on something I know has been a hot topic for years, and I don't know if there is any movement in the legislature. I mean, you're getting brownfields money and you got to pay prevailing wage. I know it's been talked about a lot of times that almost kills the project sometimes or spends money unwisely. Is that going to be addressed in this legislature?
So we had a real estate event at CINJ where Assemblyman Karabedchek, who had the bill where, and by the way, he's a general contractor in McCutcheon. Long story short, we actually brought that issue up. We said, look, Assemblyman, prevailing wage really shies people away from projects. And look, Phil, to be honest with you, it's such a tough issue to tackle. We could try it, but we've tried it in years past. It's just not something that is easily done because it's just something that exists. Unfortunately, what you're seeing is people just build that into their project costs. I mean, it's just unfortunate.
Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, but the prevailing wages does not apply to the upfront studies, but it doesn't apply to the actual remediation. Is that correct?
It applies to the construct. Yeah, right.
Doesn't provide, it doesn't, professional services are exempt. I think that's
Right.
yeah,
Yes.
consulting, stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, you know. We want to jump into PFAS?
Yeah, PFAS, but let me just kind of share with you some of the bills that could be coming our way
Okay,
that, were introduced again, something called the Safe Playing Fields Act that deals with pesticides, low carbon concrete. This goes back to climate change. This goes back to, the Flood Control Mitigation and Prevention Act. There's one that's been around for many, many years, but it was reintroduced where the DEP purchases contaminated properties, residential, they demolish them, and then this is use of the spill fund. Again, and I want to caution everybody, some of these bills have been around for years, but they were reintroduced. Another bill which would prohibit the construction of fossil fuels. What were some of the other ones? Prohibit another bill where, it's going to prohibit the use of, how you get the paper receipts, at stores?
Yeah.
You can have bisphenol A. Then there's another bill called the Plastic Pollution Task Force that creates a task force to look at plastic pollution. And then, by the way, if you have a gas blower, leaf blower, there's a bill to prohibit the use and sale of gas blowers. So just go back to what I said earlier that, a lot of these initiatives really go back to the Energy Master Plan, which we really didn't talk about, and the climate change initiatives. And real quick, and then we can kind of get into PFAS. But so the Energy Master Plan came out in 2019, and a lot of people say, well, what the heck does that mean, an Energy Master Plan? Right? It's the governor's wish list, right? Let's decarbonize the transportation sector. Let's create energy efficient buildings, right? Now, remember, if you're a developer now, and you're going to now have to design, a certain way. There were 7 goals in the Energy Master Plan. 7 goals, very laudable. Let's bring in wind. Let's bring in more solar. Let's move away from the non-renewable fuels. So what you're going to see is, and I think now that the governor got reelected, now that the legislature is in place, you're going to see the Energy Master Plan. You're going to see climate change, and we're going to see a lot of these issues, right? Because you need enabling legislation to do it. You're going to see a lot of these bills coming out. And I got to tell you, Phil, it's going to be a resource issue where usually, and Mike can tell you this, the change here is you don't have much time to react to a lot of these issues. They'll get introduced, heard, and then, before you know it, it gets signed into law.
are we going to see self-serve gas?
Wow, you brought SelfServe Gas back because I'm part of a coalition. I'm sure Mike is too, but that's still alive, believe it or not. I mean, they're trying to, and the gas station owners, and I understand this, right? First of all, you can't find people. There's a labor shortage out there. So many members have told me, you can't find people. So a lot of times, they need the ability to operate their gas stations. So if they can't find people, let's self-serve. So yes, the issue is alive. And I think they're doing a head count to see how much support they would have internally. But yeah, that issue has been around for like 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. I know Senator O'Scanlan from Monmouth County is pushing it hard and wants to really see it this time. Because there is a Royal Farms, one of the first ones in New Jersey, that is sitting in Brick, New Jersey, unopened because they can't get staff to open it.
Yeah.
So I know there's a big push. With Tony's background at CINJ and CN, what bill or initiative are you most proud of? That's a Mike Eggington question. What bill in your history at CIANJ and the Chemistry Council are you most proud of? What initiative?
That's an easy one. One of our companies, and I've actually become good friends with him, had the innovative idea 8 years ago to shred computer hard drives on the back of a truck. Right? Because before you had to go to a Class D facility and you had to shred them. So he came up where he said, look, the banks, the hospitals, they all want to see the destruction happen on site. Now, this was 8 years ago, before all these data breaches. Now, for sure, a lot of companies are very sensitive to data breaches. So fast forward, we worked with the DEP, we worked with Governor Christie at the time, and it actually sits on my wall here. It was a one-page bill that was signed into law that actually, and you talk about consumer choice, good for business. Before it was only 2 facilities that were doing it, and that opened it up to 27. So that took about a year, but that was a good example of how you could change the law to actually help the economy and help the environment.
I like that. So I know this is close to George's heart, so we're going to talk a little bit about emerging contaminants and PFAS and where do we see it. I know, the other day there was a lot of, comments on the Slag meeting that, basically if you take a sample in your backyard, you're going to find PFAS and it's everywhere. And, the state is now looking at soil standards for PFAS and, where are we going?
Yeah, and CI&J through the EBC, the Environmental Business Network, we formed an emerging contaminants work group. We're actually going to meet this morning. I think, Phil, here's what you have to understand is that legislators, the governor, they watch the news, they read the news, they see that this is an issue that's making the news. And so, and this is the classic battle of, do you regulate it or do you, prohibit it? And I think, by the way, I think a lot of the companies that use the PFAs have decided on their own, either through legislation or, on their own to do away with it. So these are legacy issues, right, that we're dealing with here. But, what worries me is that, and this is why this coalition that we're this work group is, let's work with the DEP, let's work with the legislature to figure out what the best course of action here is. And whether it's, coming out with standards, maybe some legislation. It's just something that you got to monitor. But, people read the news and a lot of times, going back to what I said about the legislative session, I mean, there are 10,000 bills that get introduced, some good ideas, some bad ideas, but, that's the process that we have. And what we want to kind of monitor is, if this whole PFAS thing starts to go, I know the department is collecting a lot of data. It's really on the water side and then the soil side. So I think it's clearly going to be an issue for this year. I mean, it's just a question of, how they deal with it.
Dr. Berkowitz?
Thanks, Phil. Why don't I just wait till the end? If you have other questions, why don't you just take them first?
We have other topics, so we're on. If you want to talk about emerging contaminants, talk now.
Yeah, well, okay. Emerging contaminants. Buckle your seatbelt. There are thousands of compounds that are going to emerge as emergency contaminants. We just had a new one on January 18th, where the acronym is almost as long as the name of the compound: chloroperfluoropolyether carboxylates, 1.9 parts per trillion. It's an interim standard. It's in play now. And it needs to be evaluated now. That doesn't mean do you have to test for it. The department actually shows that you could use ITRC guidance if you want to avoid evaluation for those compounds, and I highly recommend that you do that. I'm not going to go any further into ECs. We have a 1-hour session coming up in March that it talks about the emergence of emerging contaminants and how it's happened. And because of the efforts in Europe and because of the efforts under TSCA, you're going to see all these new compounds regulated at parts per trillion level. So just get ready for it.
George is giving his own session a plug for next month.
Thank you.
That was good. I like that. And the interesting part again out of Slag the other day is, yes, they're promulgating these standards, but there are no laboratories that can do the analysis. So stay tuned. And they recognize it, which makes it even funnier, as to how you go about doing this. Environmental justice, we heard a lot about it, We still hear about it more in administrative orders part, because rules seem to be sitting at the governor's office or somebody's office. What do we expect in this year for environmental justice?
Well, I think it's important for people to know that that legislation was signed in September of 2020. So it was definitely a landmark kind of a bill. Because, for folks that remember, I remember environmental justice issues. The company was called St. Lawrence Cement down in Camden back in the turn of 1999, 2000. So the whole environmental justice initiatives have been around for a while, but New Jersey passed the law, and I guess the commissioner a year later, right, September of 2021, issues an administrative order, right, because they spent the better part of the year having these stakeholder meetings. And just so folks know, there's I think 310 areas that have been designated as environmental justice areas. So that's a lot. And that was based on, census data, income data, and really it applies to, and this is what's important, because it applies to major air sources, so Title V facilities. It involves, incinerators, sludge, water treatment, big companies, right? I think recycling plants, are subject to it. Site remediation is not. Site remediation is not. And I think what you're going to see, Phil, is, and I think the administrative order basically said that, and this is all about involving the public, right? So you're going to see extended public hearings, comments. George was an air guy. George, I remember this issue 20 years ago. It was all about cumulative risk. So if you have two chemical plants next to each other, how do you combine their risk? And that's complicated. I mean, it's not easy. And so I think this is definitely going to be an issue this year in terms of how the dust is going to settle with the regs and which companies really go through that first to see how did the process play out? Did it help improve community relationships? Did it help improve the environment? Because nobody's denying it's a good program. Everybody, it always gets the intent. I tell people the intent of 99.9%, if not all, legislation is always good intent. It's how do you apply it, right? It's how do you implement it, and that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of process, cost, time. And so what I think is going to happen this year, Phil, is we'll probably see regs. We'll probably see a couple of companies go through it, that are subject to it. So it's something that people should just keep on their radar. But again, site remediation is not part of it.
Professor Eggington had a comment.
Thanks, Phil. Not really a comment. I do have to jump, and I want to say this has been a great session, but I wanted to put a nice sort of plug in for Tony Russo. I've had the honor of his friendship and working alongside Tony. Gosh, Tony, it's got to be almost close to 25 years, right? I've been in town for 30. And of course, George and you, Phil. But I'll tell you, Tony now runs a major trade association. He not only has to cover environment and energy, he's got to do what I do, cover labor, economic development, healthcare, the whole gamut. He absolutely does a fantastic job, bar none, on the environment energy side of the equation. For the folks that are on this session, yes, this is a testimonial because I've worked with him at DEP, many long hour stakeholder meetings over in the State House. You couldn't ask for a better advocate for the business community on those issues. So I had to say that because it's been great working with Tony, and now he has a litany of all the other issues that he has to tackle. But near and dear to his heart, as you guys know, is the environment energy. So just, I had to say that and put a nice plug in for my friend here.
Thank you, Michael. And you know what? Ditto. And do we have to disclose that I'm paying you to say that, or?
No, it's just been great working with you, and I felt the need to at least give you a nice plug because you do a fantastic job, Tony.
And by the way, what's my nickname for you, Mike?
Mayor of the State House.
Mayor of the State House. Everybody, so.
And I have to go to the State House, but a great session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike.
And Tony Best, and you all can always reach out to me as well, because as Tony pointed out, it's a collaboration working with all the trade groups that we move the needle on some of these things. So thank you all very much. All right.
Mike, you're as good looking as ever, buddy.
I'm getting older though, George.
I'm not. I don't understand it.
I guess, Tony, we're at 9 o'clock. That went quick. I guess any closing remarks, and if there's one thing that, us as residents of New Jersey, business owners of New Jersey, employees in New Jersey, that we want to take away and really key on this year, what do you think that would be? Is the money? Follow the money?
100%, Phil. To me, and I've told our board this, again, we may not see this again.
Yeah.
We may not see this again where there's money. There's money to improve our roads, right? But yet the gas tax goes up. I'm sorry, not the gas tax. The actual gas prices are going up. The tolls went up. I mean, so our businesses need help, right? And so if we spend this money wisely, I think we could really set ourselves up economically for years to come, right? And again, we're focusing in on the ports, we're focusing in on the airport. So yes, absolutely, people should be engaged, should demand transparency, accountability. Where did the money go? How is it spent? More importantly, have a stakeholder process, hear from the public, hear those, suggestions, because, if we approach this collaboratively, it's going to be a good thing. And then behind that is, it's all about sustainability. Again, you guys remember back 20 years ago. Sustainability was definitely the catchphrase, and people were focused on that, and that's real. It's good for business, it's good for the environment, but the markets will definitely, lead us in that direction.
And I think you said it, but I mean, everybody's voice counts. If somebody has an idea, somebody needs assistance, somebody has a project, reach out to CIANJ, the Environmental Business Council, once a quarter. I mean, there's places to get the information, but also to get help,
Yes.
if you need the assistance. And, we have to give the plug because, we got to follow what Hal Bozart said. I mean, becoming a member of CIANJ is also, you have member benefits. So you want to plug that too and make sure people become members because you get your best bang for your buck.
I appreciate that, Phil. And again, thank you to you, George and Jules. I think what you guys have done with CPES has been fantastic. And I know we've partnered with you on a couple of events. I look forward to doing another one. So yeah, visit our website, and also our magazine goes out to, is read by 40,000 business professionals. April is our Earth month, where we're going to dedicate everything about good environmental stories. So be on the lookout for an email asking for suggestions.
And there's also a special edition coming out this spring.
Yes, two. Can I mention them real quick?
Yeah, you mentioned them. Go. Yep.
Ocean County, thank you to Phil, because now Phil is the chair of the Greater Toms River Chamber of Commerce. We're working on a special issue featuring the Jersey Shore, Toms River, Seaside Heights, but we're also working with the recycling industry on doing a special edition just focused on recycling itself. And these are in addition to the monthly issues that we put out. So I'm excited. We're doing a lot of good things with the magazine. Readership is up. People love the digital edition, and we're getting a lot of play there. So yeah, I'll offer some suggestions, and we're happy to work with everybody on it.
Phil, before we close, I want to jump in for 1 second. First of all, I too, before we came online live, I was telling Tony how much I admire the work that he's done over the course of the years and how he continues to make CIANJ one of the premier, if not the premier, trade groups in the state of New Jersey. Tony, congratulations, and thank you for sharing your time with us. Second of all, I want people to know that there are no money that exchanges hands on any of these 1-hour sessions that we do. Why do we do it? Why does CPES do it? Because it's our commitment to developing a true professional in the field of environmental protection. And we do it because we can do it and because we think it should be done. That's number one. Number two. Number three simply is, Tony, I want to make a commitment to you. I want to fight the rap, and I want to help you fight the rap. And I want to be involved with you in terms of fixing the remedial action permit program, and I'd be willing to take the lead to that end.
Look, George, let's do it.
Okay, you got it.
Let's form a work group.
You got it. And Tracy's got to be part of it.
Yeah. And thanks to everybody for being on, hopefully.
Yep. Thank you very much. Everybody stay safe, stay well, and hopefully